Summer almost over. Don't hate me, just telling it the way it is. The House will soon be back in session. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk to you about what you can and cannot do to defend your own house. This is On the Line. This episode of On the Line is brought to you by Airbnb. Canada needs to take real action on bringing housing costs down, but experts agree that regulating short-term rentals like Airbnb is nothing more than a distraction. This makes sense when you consider two key statistics. Canada needs 5.8 million homes to reach affordability by 2030, and Airbnbs account for only 0.6% of Canada's overall housing stock. The closer you look, the clearer it gets that Canada needs bold action that addresses the entire housing market, not just 0.6% of it. Additionally, regulating short-term rentals would limit the productive role that Airbnbs play in helping Canadians get by. Did you know that 47% of Airbnb hosts in Canada report that income from hosting has helped them stay in their homes? To learn more about how Airbnb is helping, not hurting, Canada's economy, visit airbnb.ca/closer look. Hey guys, I hate to admit this, but here we are. Summer is almost over, and yes, I know the Earth hasn't gone far enough around the sun yet. But look, I got two young kids and my wife's a teacher. Summer ends when all of a sudden my house gets real quiet, and that's coming up real soon. You know what else is coming up real soon? Parliament. The return of politics. The politicians will soon be coming back. They'll start with cabinet and caucus meetings soon enough. The House will be in session. Where do we stand? What's the Carney government up to? What are the opposition parties up to? My guest to talk about all of this, Christopher Nardi, a guy I can't pretend I don't like the guy. He's been a friend of mine for years, ever since I met him when he was an intern at the National Post, where I worked at the time. Right now, he's a reporter at the Parliamentary Bureau in Ottawa for the National Post. He's my first guest today. We talk all things political right here on the line. Christopher Nardi, reporter, National Post. You know, Nards, I don't even remember what your official title is anymore. You're on the Parliament Bureau, but what's your official title?
Parliamentary reporter.
All right, that'll do.
Guy who writes stuff for money.
That's so say we all. So here's the funny thing, and here you and I are not going to do a good job setting up the awesomeness of this conversation we're about to have. But you and I were just talking a minute ago about what we should talk about, and we didn't have a lot coming to mind because it's the end of summer. And how much of official Ottawa is currently unofficial Ottawa? Like 10%?
Oh, it's a ghost town. I did see some people on Spark Street after 11 p.m. last week, and it was so notable. I videoed it, sent it to my wife. So that gives you a vibe. It is Parliament as a building. Is West Block is empty. I'm sure senators aren't around. Staff are not around. There was a meeting last week with Mark Carney. It was all virtual. I couldn't even tell you if the Prime Minister came into his office for it, presumably, but no one is around. Ottawa is not the epicenter of attention right now. It is definitely either DC or wherever the Prime Minister is traveling to.
When will that change? And this is a question, I'm going to ask this question in two ways. When would it normally change, and when will it actually change this year? Are we on a different schedule right now?
Yes and no. If you're asking, like, when does Ottawa, the city, come back to life? It's absolutely when the House returns mid-September. I think it's September 15th or 16th, that Monday. That's when Ottawa comes back to life. When does Ottawa as a concept, the big O Ottawa, in a sense, come back to life? Usually that would be when there's cabinet and caucus retreats that start up. And that's to be coming in the next couple of weeks. There's going to be a Liberal caucus retreat. There's going to be a Liberal cabinet retreat. And that's when, the government's gears start running from, okay, you were in your riding, you were doing work, you were meeting with your constituents, you were working on this famous plan due by August 28th to propose 15% cuts across your department if you're a minister. You were doing all that kind of exercise, and then it's going to come to head at a caucus and then cabinet meeting so that the government is prepared come mid-September when the House of Commons returns, featuring Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre.
So I want to do the weirdo columnist thing, and then you can do the straight guy reporter right down the middle, just the facts, ma'am reply here. One of the things I've been struggling with this summer is trying to separate how much of the quietness, as you call it, from Big O, Ottawa, is just normal summer quietness versus new government quietness, right? Like, 'cause you got to staff up, you got to set priorities. But I'm also trying to get a read on what a Mark Carney prime ministership is going to look like. And I don't have that read yet. And I'm just being as honest as I can. The guy's been prime minister longer than it feels, right? He's been prime minister the day you and I record this, almost exactly 4 months. He was prime minister about 6 weeks, I think, before that, because he took over when Justin Trudeau resigned. So the guy's been prime minister not quite 6 months, but he's getting close to it. I don't really have a sense yet what a Mark Carney prime ministership is going to look, sound, and feel like. Are we going to find that out quick?
Well, I think there have been signs, and I think we're getting a sense of it. But it depends what you're looking for, truly. As in, are you looking for the House of Commons prime minister? Are you looking for diplomat prime minister? Because we've seen a whole lot of diplomat prime minister, a lot more interest in foreign affairs than I'd argue Justin Trudeau had, which he was interested in, and Pierre Poilievre will ever have. Because as we know, if ever he forms prime minister, fundamentally Pierre Poilievre is not a foreign policy man, and it annoys him to have to do it. And it obviously annoys him tremendously that Donald Trump became what he became to Canada, both because he has to deal with it and because he lost the election because of it. But Mark Carney, as a man, as the head of government, is very directive. He knows where he wants to go. I would say that what we've seen up to date is that he's not always great at telling everyone what he's thinking. And because there have been a number of moments, and I can think of at least one off the top of my head immediately in the last few weeks, where he has a policy in his mind. He has asked a kind of left field question, or maybe on an unexpected policy question in a press conference, where he gives an answer that is notable and that it is new because he's never been asked about this policy before, and will say, our government is considering this, but our government does not know that yet. He is our government, and our government, including his policy team, then have to go inquire and extract the policy out of his mind when trying to respond to follow-up questions from people like you or me as to what he meant exactly. And so the example I will give you was this summer, he was doing a press conference on wildfires out in BC, if I'm not in the Okanagan Valley. And he was asked by a reporter, hey, we are trying to do news on this, but we are blocked from news on meta platforms, as we know, since the Online News Act. And so the reporter asked, are you considering rescinding or modifying the Online News Act to get news back on the Meta? And he kind of pondered, he gave a response about how CBC Radio Canada is very important. And then he said, but we're also looking at ways to effectively increase the reach of local media as well across the board online. And then he says, to your question, that is something that we are thinking about. He effectively was suggesting that, yes, I am thinking about modifying or rescinding the Online News Act, which was news to his policy team, because when I go and try to ask more, they're like, let's find out. And so that's what's interesting about him, is that he has a lot of ideas. He has a very clear direction, I think, in his own mind of where he wants to go on things. But because there's such a wide gamut of things that a prime minister has to deal with, and he clearly has things that he's focused on, he is focused on communicating what he believes on key issues, whether it's U.S.-Canada relations, defense, spending, government spending, procurement, everything that was in that well-known kind of mandate letter, and everything else. He probably has an idea of what he wants to go on, but hasn't necessarily communicated because that's not what he's focusing on. So that's, I think, maybe in a weirdly long nutshell, how Mark Carney works as a prime minister. He's varied. He can be very directive. He knows where he wants to go. He's hyper-focused on a set number of issues. And then the other ones, he goes where he's going, but we'll get there when we get there.
I'm going to make a comment that's going to sound more partisan than I intend, so I'm going to awkwardly buttress it with further comments. Lucky you. I don't think I'm being too partisan when I say that by the end of Trudeau's tenure, nobody was happy. You know, the Liberal caucus was mad. Liberal supporters said it was time for a change. 20% of the public that ended up voting for Mark Carney was telling pollsters they would not vote for Justin Trudeau, on and on and on. everybody wanted a change by the end of the Trudeau era. What I'm trying to figure out, Chris, and I don't know yet, is whether or not we're going to get one. And we're going to get one in a lot of ways. We're going to get a change of tone. You've already mentioned the diplomacy thing. I think you're bang on about that. From getting the king to fly here from the throne speech to having the G7 and then a bunch of NATO meetings. Carney's obviously more engaged in that. But as you well know, I hate this term, but I'm going to use it. The machinery of government.
Yeah, great term.
It is what it is. And it wasn't working that well under the last guy. Is Carney a guy who's going to be able to get it working? Is he a guy who's going to be interested in getting it working? Or is he going to be in his office, fire off a couple of directives, and then in 6 months be surprised that none of it happened?
What I will say about that is that I think that there's a fundamental reworking of the machinery of government right now. It is a quiet process that is being done internally, and part of that process is actually not just we want you to cut and snip, and yes, RCMP put the musical right at the top and we'll ignore that as they do every time. But what they want is departments to look at how they work and cut what the services and programs that aren't actually necessary and repatriate that money elsewhere, that money elsewhere. It's not just cut and get us to 15%, but keep working the same way you are. What Mark Carney and his new clerk, Michael Sabia, are looking for is propose us a plan that, yes, finds us 15%, proposes 15% of spending cuts, but also fundamentally alters how your department works, what services or programs it decides to fund. I'll give you a good example. There are some departments that work almost exclusively, their spending is the bulk of it is grants and contributions. Mm-hmm. Heritage Canada is a good example of that. Yeah. They don't want Heritage Canada's deputy minister to come to them and say, well, here's 15% of grants and contribution programs that we're going to cut. They want Heritage and the minister, Stephen Guilbeault, to come to them and say, we are actually investing in these spaces that we don't think are getting money for value. We're getting rid of that, and we're reallocating that money to this other grant and contribution that we're not going to cut. We're going to triple it or quadruple it. And so the machinery of government is shifting. I've noticed, and I cannot tell you if this is linked to the changes or not, but the head of machinery of government at PCO was a gentleman called Alan Sutherland, and he left on June 30th, I believe. He left government. He had been at the head of machinery of government within the Privy Council office for quite a long time, and he shifted. I have no idea if it was related to the changes. Michael Sabia hadn't come in yet. Mr. Sutherland had a very long, career in public service, and maybe he just wanted to change. I do not know. But there are fundamental changes happening or being brought or being envisioned for how the machinery of government works, which is the only way that you truly fix a public service that for so many years Canadians have increasingly seen two things happening to. It's grown tremendously and it's offered lackluster services. And that's why I kind of always get a giggle, and you would probably too, when I see stories that say like the CRA union says our call centers aren't working, with the cuts it's going to get worse. Both of those things can and may be true. The call centers are definitely a problem. They may be worse if you have less people. But if you look at the incredible amount of people that have been hired in the CRA call centers in the last few years, and the service has not gotten better, you've also got people are also questioning that.
One of the things that I thought, I've got some questions to ask you more on the politics front than the policy, but one of the things I would add to that is, look, I've been doing this longer than I want to admit. Like, I've stared into the abyss so long, it has definitely stared back at me. And one of the things I find interesting is how I said a minute or two ago that by the end of the Trudeau tenure, everybody was unhappy with that. I've almost never seen unanimity in opinion of the government is broken. And I'm not saying that in a Pierre Poilievre, everything feels broken way. I mean, if you know where to look, if you're reading in the right spaces, if you're talking to the right people, even the people inside the government who are very much responsible for the government not being dysfunctional are pretty openly saying, oh, this is dysfunctional. Like, it's pretty shocking. Some of these guys are now retired civil servants, but there are even people in the civil service. And I think you were touching on that. There's even polls of the civil service itself where none of them feel like it's working well. Yep. And I think anything we're going to want to do under any prime minister, whether it's Mark Carney today or Pierre Poilievre 5 years from now or whatever, none of them are going to be able to execute on what they want to do unless they actually do this really, really hard work. And I don't know if it didn't happen under Justin Trudeau because Trudeau wasn't personally engaged enough or because the blob was resisting. I honestly don't know. And I guess we're going to find out if Carney does any better, assuming he tries.
It's interesting because during Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's era, I would argue that there was a rethinking in program delivery specifically, and very early in the COVID years was when this happened, right? CERB is a great example of designing and implementing and literally shelling out money within, I think it was 3 to 5 weeks. Everything happened A to Z. And a lot of programs were digitized. They announced an online passport application portal, which to this day is still only quasi-functional. And I've never seen this before, an online portal that limits the amount of people that can actually apply in a day. I don't know what that's about. But a lot of what happens is that when you seize a crisis, it appears in government, you do the work, you make these changes, and then the changes disappear. The digitization, of services like hit this peak, and then in many, like the momentum just gone. And there was a rethinking of how we do and offer public services, public programs, and they're designed, and then that momentum is kind of gone at the end of the Trudeau era, right? This institutional inertia kicks back in again, and suddenly the good ideas that you could seize on from the crisis aren't as good anymore. We come back with the red tape or processes, branded how you want, and things really, really slow back down. So what you need is a fundamental reshaping of how these things work. But the problem is governments are so risk averse that they cut down on processes. And then the first story that comes out that says XYZ department spent so much money on this useless in the eyes of the public thing that because they didn't do the checks and balances, that suddenly 3 more layers are added to it. And you're back to this bad habit of implementing so many processes because the public service cannot handle a bad headline or two. And you actually, what this ends up being is needing to build resilience for the public-facing part of the public service so that they stop responding so strongly and so negatively and so protectionist, fortress to bad headlines that are legitimate, and instead just think, how can we do this better, but let's not make it more complicated. And that's not a reflex that it has.
I'm trying to remember. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember there was like a slightly tone deaf Easter tweet from like a ministerial or a departmental account like 2 years ago. Yeah. And it kicked off like a 9-day exchange of emails among senior officials. And it was, I don't even know if there was a news story about it. It was just weirdos like you and me tweeting about it and like having a laugh. And it froze an entire ministry for over a week, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I want to ask you political questions now, because I think that kind of covers a little bit of what's happening on the government side. We only got a few minutes left before you got to bail. Pierre Poilievre reelected. He'll be returning to the House, now representing the absolute beating heart of the center of gravity of the Conservative Party of Canada now. Any expectations on when he returns? Are you hearing anything about how he's going to return, or are we expecting him to come back as if nothing's changed?
Well, he'll come back. He's excited to come back. I think his caucus is somewhat excited to have him back in the sense that they were a decapitated opposition for the 5 weeks of the spring and just kind of sat there and agreed with the government on C5, the one economy bill, and then it moved on. So I do think that it will significantly change the color and the dynamic in the House of Commons. Admittedly, Pierre Poilievre has showed that he's a very, very effective leader of the opposition when it comes demanding a prime minister, a politician opposing him, and changing public opinion on him. What he's not as successful on is changing public opinion about himself and rebranding himself. And that is going to be his exercise and his challenge throughout this parliament. He's obviously been told that he needs to be less full frontal oppositional and be more propositional oppositional, if that makes sense. Propose ideas clearly, and while opposing, and we've seen him try to do that. I'll give an example of Friday when Mark Carney announced that he was dropping some of the retaliatory counter tariffs on products that weren't covered by CUSMA, by CUSMA. Pierre Poilievre came out, did a presser. It wasn't entirely clear what he was proposing, but he was saying, like, I want to fight with Carney. Carney, come to us, use our ideas. But he was also saying, like, Carney's incompetent. This never would have happened if I was prime minister. But normally, old Pierre, I lost in Carleton Pierre, would have said Mark Carney is the worst human that ever walked Earth, and he is the reason Donald Trump exists. I'm obviously exaggerating, but his rhetoric was really strong.
Honestly, if you're exaggerating, it ain't by much.
It ain't by much. Like, he would have come out super strongly, would have said there's no redeeming quality about Mark Carney that has ever existed on this God's green earth, and it's done. And so his tone has changed. But he is not someone who changes easily nor quickly. And so coming to the House of Commons, I think, is where Pierre is will struggle to not revert to his old self that he was for 20 years as a parliamentarian, a very strong, oppositional, confronting, name-calling occasionally person. And so he's going to try to be the no glasses, smiling more, opposing, rebranding, yes, but proposing and trying to sound like even more of an adult in the room than Mark Carney. We'll see if it sticks. Truly, I'm very curious, but it absolutely changes the dynamic for Mark Carney too, who's cruised through Parliament back in the spring for 5 weeks, and it's going to be a very different reality for him now.
Thanks to the Pierre Poilievre of old, the line had to establish a style guide use of the word wacko.
Wacko. Yep.
That was not something, because I wanted to have it W-H-A, and Jen thought it should be just W-A, and ultimately we went...
Same debate internally here.
the things they don't tell you about when you start working in this biz. All right, one more question for you here, and then you got to bail because you're actually doing your day job today over on Parliament Hill. The NDP.
Yep.
I don't know if I have I don't know if I have anything more to ask. Like, just the NDP. We just had that Air Canada strike, and I assume they had a position. I can probably take a pretty good guess what it was, but I don't know for sure because I never heard.
The NDP. Period.
The NDP.
NDP. Yeah.
Do we know when they'll have a leader? I think we'll find out more.
No, I actually think that we'll find out. We know when they'll have a leader. That's January. When they I'm 99% sure it's January. But as you kind of pointed to, we haven't talked about the NDP in so long. I don't actually remember exactly, but I'm 99% sure that their leadership convention is in January. I'm just hoping I'm not mixing it up with Pierre Poilievre's leadership review, which is also in January. That being said, the NDP we're just existing right now. We're licking wounds. We're trying to fundraise. We're trying to attract people to run for leadership. That race has not started. I believe that starts in September. And until then, they have been real quiet. They are real quiet. It is a party that is truly in disarray. It was in financial ruin after the election. I'm going to assume, just an educated assumption, that they have not dug themselves out of that hole in the matter of 4 months. And so, no, we have barely heard of them. They also obviously are incredibly hampered by the fact that without official party status, they don't have the communications and research and resources that they would have had just 4 months ago. And so it is much harder for them to cut through the noise of the much more dominant conservative and liberals.
Honestly, Nards, it's wild to me, right? Because the Canadian journalism or political history, whatever you want to call it, is just chock full of examples of guys like you or I going, well, this party will never recover, or this party will never recover. People wrote off the Liberals before Justin Trudeau came and saved them, and then they wrote off the Liberals before Justin Trudeau resigned. The Conservative Party has been written off repeatedly. I know that, but I'm looking at the NDP today, and I'm not going to write them off. Once bitten, twice shy. But I'm looking at them, and I don't know how these guys come back. I'm not saying they can't. I just don't see the path because there's so little left. There's not much to rebuild around. It's
not unheard of. back in 93, I was reading about this after the election. Back in 93, they had a very similar exercise where I believe they only had two MPs. And they managed to rebuild, and they found Jack Layton. So there are very few parties that are down and out in Canadian politics amongst the four, I'd say the big four of NDP, Conservative, Liberal, and Bloc. That being said, the challenges are tremendous. And what it has taken away from them is the opportunity to make as much of a difference in Parliament now as they did, arguably, since they signed that supply and confidence agreement under Justin Trudeau. I realize, and there are kind of two schools of thoughts about Jagmeet Singh back in 2021, I think. And the first is, on a political level, signing that agreement, siding with the government, was one of the worst political decisions for that party, because effectively tagged it so closely to the Liberals that when the Liberals became unpopular, so did they, and they were never successfully able to take credit for any achievements, policy achievements. On the flip side, I do think that you can argue that on a purely policy level, Jagmeet Singh, in hindsight, may be viewed as one of the NDP's most effective leaders, especially this century, because he managed to get a bunch of the NDP policy into law, or into the Liberal agenda. And then, even though he was never really successfully able to take credit for it, there is a $10 a day childcare program that exists for now. Mm-hmm. There are the outlines of there's not really outlines of pharmacare, but there are a number of things that he's pushed for, a lot of changes in the COVID programs, EI programs, that are entirely NDP policy that he was able to push through because of the deal. So it kind of depends how we looked at it. Did he ruin his party in exchange for policy? It's in my very short-term, post-hindsight eyes, it looks like it. But now they have to recover from that. They will find a new leader. It's going to be very hard to find a new leader, I think, because the new leader is not coming back to a party that is either wealthy, well-resourced, well-staffed, or has anything. So it's going to be a slog. Are they down and out? I'm just like you. I'm not ready to discount any party just because they're going through a tough time. But are they going to be a major factor in the next couple of years? I'd be really surprised if so.
Yeah, no, which is obviously hugely to Mark Carney's benefit, right? He's got his right flank sealed up and he's wide open on the left, and that's a pretty good place for a Liberal prime minister to be. Chris, you got to bail. You got to walk across the campus up in Ottawa. Always a pleasure, man. Great to talk to you. I was joking before, as beautiful as the day I met you. Great to see you again, man. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Cheers, Matt.
This episode is also brought to you by the Métis Nation of Ontario. It's Pettatanguishene, 1840. More than a decade after relocating from Drummond Island, a group of Métis families signed their names to paper. Their petition was simple: recognize us and our rights. The answer was a policy formally excluding Métis communities from recognition, denying their existence for generations. But the petitions did not stop. From Pettatanguishene to Sault Ste. Marie, Fort Frances, and north to Moose Factory, Métis in Ontario insisted they are a distinct Indigenous people with their own history, identity, and rights. That fight has carried forward into self-government agreements with Canada. Today, the Métis Nation of Ontario is a recognized Métis government with the authority to build its own laws, institutions, and future. What began as a petition nearly 2 centuries ago lives on in the work of the MNO today, ensuring that Métis rights are recognized for generations to come. To learn more, visit OntarioMétisFacts.com. That was Christopher Nardi of the National Post Parliamentary Bureau. Always nice to talk with an old friend. Great to get him here. And we'll all be back to work soon enough. Coming up in a couple of moments, a very different conversation, but one that is very much in the news right now. Ian Runkle will join me. He is a lawyer. He is an expert in firearms law and self-defense law. He is also a YouTuber. You can see his broadcasts at Runkle of the Bailey on YouTube, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. He's joining me to give me just the facts about what you are and are not allowed to do to defend yourself if you are at home and someone breaks in. Obviously, we're responding to this story out of Lindsay, Ontario, but Ian shares with us a bunch of other stories or scenarios that he has encountered in his career. And I also ask him, how do we fix it? Because I think most people agree the law ain't perfect right now. We're not getting the balance quite right. He has a solution, and much to my pleasure, relief, It's very similar to the kind of idea I'd already been writing about. Here is my conversation with Ian Runkle. And again, check him out on YouTube at Runkle of the Bailey. Ian, great to have you here, especially because I know you're on the road and you had to juggle hotel Wi-Fi and a bit of technology to join me today. Look, normally, Ian, under normal circumstances, we would have booked you a week or two in advance, but I think, as you well know, you're here because of the news that came out last week from Lindsay, Ontario, a town I know well, of an unusual incident where there was, I'm going to put this in very banal language. There was an encounter when a man intruded into another man's home. Both men have been arrested. The man who was the intruder has been charged with possessing a weapon and break and enter and violating probation. And the home occupant has been arrested with assault with a weapon and aggravated assault for reasons that the police haven't really explained yet. All they've basically said is be patient. There will be more to come. This is controversial, Ian. As you know, people are arguing about it. There's fights. You know, we need full castle doctrine, or your possessions are never worth a life, blah, blah, blah. I don't actually care that much about the debate. I want to ask you a very simple question, or maybe not that simple. What's the law?
So this is probably the least simple question in the law because, quite frankly, the self-defense law is very complicated. The standard is reasonable under the circumstances. Now, the circumstances can include all sorts of things. In this case, 3:20 a.m. is what we've heard, for when this went down. People are probably asleep at that point. So the circumstances will include that you're waking up from sleep, that somebody is intruding into your home, and reasonableness includes, and they give this long list of things that must be sort of considered as part of this, but it can consider just about anything. Age, the physical capabilities, like are you disabled? Gender is considered. Size is considered, the role of the people in the incident. So, for instance, the home invader is in a bad spot for role of the person in the incident, whereas the person who is at home is in a much stronger spot. All of these things, whether there's any past history, like was this a stranger who's coming in? Was this somebody who had, for instance, if somebody's been sending you emails every week threatening to kill you, and then they break into your house with a knife, that's something that would also be considered. None of these details are things that we have, but the law basically says considering everything. If we look at the recent case of Cahill, which went to the Supreme Court, the court said that also includes like his decision to go outside to confront somebody who was breaking into his truck was also considered. So it's a very holistic consideration, which also makes it very difficult for any lawyer to provide, a clear answer. If you called me in the middle of the night and said, hey, somebody's breaking in, and this is kind of a fanciful scenario because there's no real circumstance where you'd be doing that. But if you called in the middle of the night and said, somebody's breaking in, what am I allowed to do in self-defense? I couldn't give you a clear yes, no answer. I'd be like, let me walk you through the considerations, and it's going to come down to sort of the fuzzy notions of what a jury or a judge ultimately determines, which is part of the problem, is that we see people who get charged and may ultimately be acquitted, but the process of having been charged is very difficult, very stressful, very expensive, because all of this, lawyers rarely work for free. And there's a lot of work that goes into taking a case like this to trial, especially because you have to then consider all of this stuff and maybe even do things like bring in experts, firearms experts, psychologists or psychiatrists, or potentially people you're going to want to engage to talk about, the psychology of adrenaline, these sorts of things. There's a subjective element to it. Does the person actually believe that they are in serious danger? There's reasonableness to it. Is that belief itself reasonable? All of these things become very, very complicated. And it doesn't end up feeling like justice if you have somebody whose house was broken
Yeah.
into and they were in a deadly threat situation, they defend themselves, and it ends up costing them six figures to ultimately have the court say, yes, that was within acceptable behavior. So we get this real break here between a lot of lawyers that I'm seeing comment online saying there are very broad protections. And in fairness, the protections are fairly broad. Reasonableness is a range. And so long as you're within the range of reasonable, the law protects you. And further, the crown, the government, has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that your behavior was outside of reasonable. So when you think of that, that's sort of two layers of, the benefit going to you as the accused person. And the case law is also clear that the use of force is not to be measured. The language that gets used is, to a nicety. And that's from an old case where they said essentially a person cannot be expected to measure force to a nicety in the face of an upraised knife. But the problem is that as much as we say that, the person or people, judge or jury who are doing this are going to be sitting in comfortable chairs or semi-comfortable chairs. If you've ever seen a courtroom, it's semi-comfortable chairs. But
a little plastic hard chair.
well, often the jurors are in pews, and I think that's to try to keep them from falling asleep. But they're sitting there and they're not under threat.
Yeah.
And most people who are sitting on jurors are not. We have a sort of systematic filtering in our jury system that tends to eliminate people who might be at more risk. And the reason why I say that is that if you're poor, you probably can't afford to be on a jury for 2 weeks on, a trial. And so you might get filtered out for economic reasons. But also, if you've got a criminal record, you may be filtered out.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of these filtering effects tends to mean that we end up with people who are more comfortable, more secure, and thus are more likely to say, more likely to feel that, that any use of force is leans towards unreasonable. I've seen commentary on Twitter from people saying, well, just cooperate, just let them take your stuff and and then you'll be fine. The problem is that you don't necessarily know what the intentions of a home invader are. And if you are making the decision to just cooperate, you're essentially volunteering for whatever it is that they decide to do, because
Yeah.
by the time they decide to do more harmful things, they will already have sort of secured a position of power. Like if you're cooperating, they're going to make sure to tie you up or restrain you or, otherwise limit your access to, weaponry or an ability to escape or defend yourself. And some of these cases go really, really badly. I recently discussed this case a bit on YouTube, and one of the cases I pointed out was the case of the Queen, as it was at the time, and bins. And in that case, an innocent homeowner, they actually targeted this person because he was a used car salesman, and they saw a bunch of cars in his driveway, and they figured this guy must have a lot of money. He's got some expensive cars in his driveway. Well, that doesn't mean he's got a lot of money. It just means he's got inventory.
It's got commercial inventory. Yeah.
Yeah. And so now that he's got this commercial inventory, they think he's got a ton of money. And so they go in and they want $100,000. He doesn't have $100,000 and he certainly doesn't have it on him. And to try to get this money out of him, they tie him up and they're burning him with heated knives over the course of an hour. He ends up with permanent scarring, permanent mental, the PTSD is going to be very difficult to deal with there. And eventually they kidnap his elderly mother, has just gone through cancer treatment and is still getting chemo. And they hold her for a lengthy period while demanding that this guy find $100,000 or else they're going to kill her. That's one example. And the thing is, if you dig through the case law, you'll find other examples of people who have been tortured for lengthy periods, In some cases, assaulted in the worst ways. I don't know, I don't want to say anything that's going to get your podcast possibly
No, this is a news
demonetized,
podcast,
but
and we can talk about the facts.
okay, fair enough. In some cases, sexually assaulted.
Yeah,
In some cases, you will see, murder. There's
yeah,
a case. I forget the name of it. It's a U.S. case, but two individuals broke into a home, and after they'd done so, they decided to sexually assault the children. And then, having done that, they decided that the best way to cover this up was to set fire to the premises, which the husband managed to escape. He was downstairs and managed to sort of wiggle free and left to go get help. And while he was off trying to get help, they killed the rest of the family.
yeah. I remember the
So
case, and their excuse later was they didn't realize how young the child was while they were raping her.
yeah, it's
Yeah, I
and
remember.
this is the kind of thing that when somebody's in your house, you don't know what their intentions are. But certainly, if they're making the decision to break into an occupied home, most break and enters don't occur with occupied homes. We have
Hmm.
this notion of the burglar coming in at night and creeping in. That's not actually the usual scenario. The
No, they hit your
usual
house while you're away at work, and they grab your stuff and they leave.
broad daylight is usually the
Yeah,
thing. They check out the house while while people are at work. They have all day because they know you're not coming back until
yeah,
that closing bell.
yeah. They put on a reflective vest so they look like a maintenance guy, and they walk right to your side door. It's happened a dozen times in my neighborhood in the last couple of years.
Most people do not. Most of the burglars don't actually want
Yeah,
confrontation with homeowners. They avoid it as much as they can. If there's any indication of it, like I've had instances where um, I'm pretty sure that I was about to be the victim of a break and enter if I wasn't home, because somebody knocks on the door, and then when you respond to them, they give an answer that is very suspicious, but you just happen to notice, oh, that's an interesting little pry bar you're carrying, that kind of thing. And I've had this experience a couple of times. They were not interested in going in once they saw that somebody was home. But when somebody is making that choice to go in when somebody's home, they're often doing so very intentionally because they think that they can get more money that way. We see this targeted at people who, for instance, post boasts about their Bitcoin wealth. Well, they may get targeted by people who say, okay, well, we can't steal the Bitcoin wallet. We need to actually get this person to transfer the
yeah.
Bitcoin. And we can do that by, extreme violence aimed towards this person. You see there's cases, there was somebody who had a jewelry store, and so they decided to target that person, and the targeting included that they wanted them to open safes and so forth. And in Canada, sometimes we see this targeted at firearms owners because criminals are well aware that Canadian firearm law requires that things be locked away.
Yep.
And so they figure if I can get control right away, you open the door and immediately they've got a gun in your face or a knife or a hammer or whatever it is. And then they'll make you open the safes because that's way easier than breaking into them. But all of these things, they're coming prepared to do violence and coming prepared to do, in some cases, extreme violence. And in some situations, you see that one of the things they're sort of prepared to do is eliminate witnesses afterwards.
Of course,
You
that
don't
was part
know.
of the Connecticut case you'd mentioned. It started with robbery, and they're like, well, we're already here. It might as well escalate to rape. And after it was rape as well, they've seen our faces and we left DNA evidence. We'd better burn the house down. The two idiots were just local petty criminals who were out on parole and needed money.
Yep, and that's the thing is they may not even know their intentions until things happen. Once they're there and they've got
Yeah,
somebody tied to a chair, it's like, well, what now?
in for a
And
penny.
that what now question is extremely dangerous when you're talking about somebody who already makes bad decisions, uh, might have mental health issues, might have drug addiction issues, might be on drugs. what and sometimes they get angry. Like in the case of the that I mentioned, the bins case, they were
They
angry
were
that there was no
frustrated. Yeah.
money that they could find. They were like, "Where's all this money? We expected piles of money." And so if you're a homeowner who doesn't have $100,000 lying around to turn over, well, maybe they will get very angry at you and not be satisfied with your lack of giant piles of cash.
Let me, I'm going to ask you another question in a minute, Ian, but let me just tell you something. And it's something I've spoken about publicly before. I'm not revealing any secrets here. I am a public figure. I'm, not at the scale of a mayor or a premier, but I have a public profile, and I have been more than once the subject of sustained targeted death threats. These threats have also been targeted against my family. I have a pretty thick skin. It's part of the job. It's a lousy part of the job, but it's a part of the job. And most of the time, the threats that have come in have been very vague, to the point of going, this person doesn't know anything about me. This is just someone with a laptop or a phone banging out a threatening email. Some of them have been extremely specific and obviously revealed that someone had done their homework about me.
Yeah.
And that is the background that I would come into any late night break in to my house. You talked a little bit about factors. I'm 6'4". I'm a big guy. I'm not much of a bar brawler, but I have been in physical fights before, and I didn't lose all of them. My wife is half my size, and my kids are very young.
Yeah.
If someone and my dog would be completely useless. My dog would immediately befriend the intruder. If someone gets
Mine
through
too.
me, there is no second line of defense in my house. My assessment of reasonable is that anyone who is outside my four walls, especially in the night, is not a threat to me or my family. Anyone who comes through those four walls is a threat that I will end. And you would raise something about the injustice of the kind of the criminal justice. Here's the thing: in any realistic scenario, Ian, I think I'd be fine, but I might be fine after 200 grand in legal bills and 3 years of my life. And an interesting thing I was told once by a lawyer was a lawyer friend of mine told me, you'd never go to trial. They said, unless you did something absolutely outrageous, you'd never go to trial. Your charges would be dropped very quickly. I said, why? And he said, because you're wealthy enough to defend yourself. The Crown would know that. They wouldn't want to waste any time with you. And they also know that you'd be writing about it the entire time it was happening, and you'd become a public irritant. You'd be cleared very quickly. They said a poorer guy in a basement apartment he's renting who grabs a wrench to defend himself when someone kicks down his door in the middle of the night, that's the guy who's going to spend 3 years of his life begging on GoFundMe for legal bills. Or he'll take a plea because he can't afford to defend himself.
People take pleas all the time for that reason.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm in somewhat the same boat. I have a public figure, but also, in the course of law, you get people who are unhappy with you. I've received threats from the vague to the very specific. Like one person sent several pictures and they're from Google Maps, but the outside of my house.
The same. Yeah.
And
for me, it was my place of work, but yeah, that's what they were doing.
so, you've got somebody who took the time to figure out where I live, and it's not impossible to do, but and to send me those images. I've had a police duty to warn letter saying we are sufficiently concerned that this person might try to kill you. These kinds of things. And so if I've got somebody breaking in, I don't know who that is, but you're very much like, most prosecutors are ethical and, so forth, but they also don't like to lose.
Yeah.
And so it does end up weighing into things about like how much is somebody going to defend themselves. You do see situations where people plead out to, and in cases where they have perfectly good defenses because they go, I can't afford a trial. I can't afford to stay in custody for months. There was a case out of Ontario. A woman had stabbed her boyfriend, and he wasn't a very good boyfriend because at the time he was smashing her head against a concrete surface. she ended up, after the stabbing, she went and her injuries were so severe that the neighbors thought it must be a Halloween costume. It was early October, and they thought, why is somebody wearing a Halloween costume this early? Because she was so badly injured. And she stabbed this person in the leg, and he ended up dying. It was later dropped, and the prosecutor made some public comments about this being one of the clearest cases of self-defense. And the reason why he did that was essentially that at some point she might be looking for jobs, and the top headline would be woman arrested for, stabbing boyfriend to death. And so at least she'd have, a newspaper article that you could point to say, well, maybe that wasn't my fault. Maybe that was a bad thing. But she ended up spending many months in custody. And if it hadn't been for the fact that the charges were like murder, she might have plotted out. If somebody is sitting there, their life is getting ruined because they're in custody and they get, maybe if in this case, maybe the Crown comes back and says, listen, we'll drop the aggravated assault. We'll let you take a plea to assault causing bodily harm or assault with a weapon.
Yeah.
And we'll offer you 90 days, and you can serve that 90 days on weekends. People might well jump at that.
Yeah.
Because
get their lives back.
Well, and the alternative is, do you want to roll the dice and take it to trial? And they're going to ask for years, not days. It becomes a difficult spot. And I would love to see a situation where that is, I think that this is a place where the law and people's understanding of morality and what is right are diverging in a big way, because we don't feel that it's justice when we see somebody whose home has been invaded. They are a victim. They never did anything to encourage this or anything. And they lose, like, even in winning, they lose everything. They lose, hundreds of thousands of dollars to, because if you're charged with a murder, a six-figure defense is
routine,
pretty much necessary.
Yeah.
It's
the phrase. Oh, Ian, sorry to interrupt, but you'll have heard the phrase shoot, shut up, and shovel. And that's something I've heard repeatedly, which is, and I don't know anyone who's ever shot someone and failed to report it, but I absolutely know of cases where people have used violence to defend themselves. Sometimes it's just street encounters. A mentally disturbed person or someone like a petty criminal gets punched in the face or gets a bottle smashed over their face. And I asked the guy who defended himself, and I go, did you call it in? They're like, no, I don't need that trouble. So there's some criminal out there with a black eye and maybe a busted jaw and a citizen who's never going to report it because they don't trust the police to actually treat them fairly here.
And I think that's actually very common when you're dealing with low-level situations. Somebody comes at you and, you get instances of like somebody is robbed with a knife and they, punch the robber and the robber runs off and they've had a successful incident. They're not injured, but they think, do I really want to call the police? And this is the problem, is that when the police get there, in this instance, they only have one person, and there can be pressures on police to solve things with an arrest. So it doesn't tend to be as often with the punch situation, but let's imagine you've got somebody who's walking and they had a pocket knife and they get attacked and they pull the pocket knife and they scare the person off. And so there's no blood, there's no injuries or whatever, but they may not want to have a conversation with the officer about why they have that pocket knife, because the officer might be like, well, I can get concluded by charge out of this if I just arrest this person with the pocket knife. And I have seen that where people call the police and end up getting arrested. It's very bad advice. The whole shoot, shovel, shut up thing is very bad advice if you're dealing with like a homicide, if somebody's dead. Because at that point, the whole like shovel and all of that would be taken.
Those are other crimes.
They're other crimes, and they'd be evidence of consciousness of guilt, is the way the court phrases it. And so they'd say, like, an innocent person would call the police in this circumstance. So the fact that you didn't call the police suggests that you knew you had done wrong, and it might actually be the critical evidence to convict you.
Mm.
And the other thing is that in a self-defense case, you really want all of the evidence there. And in the process of trying to sort of hide things, you'd be hiding all of the evidence that could save you. This is not from a case. This is from a story that was relayed to me. Sort of family friend was in his garage, and he was sitting there just doing work. And a guy came in with a knife and was approaching and basically saying, "Give me your stuff." And he grabbed a pipe wrench off of one of the shelves and hit the guy. That guy fled, and the guy who got hit called the police. And his story that he told the police was, "I was just there walking in looking for directions, and I didn't, I didn't want to have any sort of confrontation. I was just there looking for directions. I was a pure innocent here." And so family friend got charged. And later, the police came, they looked, they couldn't find this knife. And the only thing that ended up really saving this guy was that the one of the officers who'd investigated basically had a bad feeling about this case. He didn't like it. It didn't stick well with him. He was a junior officer. And he came back and he said, "You don't have to let me search. I've got no authority to be here. I just want to have a look around." He's like, "I just want to have another look." And that officer spotted that there was a big tool case full of tools. And he said, "Did they move that?" "No, of course they didn't. It weighs like 1,000 pounds because it's full of tools."
Yeah.
So they pulled all the tools out, they moved it, and sure enough, that's where the knife had ended up, was under that tool case.
Yeah.
And the family friend reached for it, and the officer apparently just like physically pulled him away and said, "Do not touch that.
Yeah.
If your prints are on that, you're done."
Yeah.
And later they seized the knife. They did print checking, and they found the prints of the guy who said, "Oh, I'm just an innocent here." But you can see just how close it was from that guy potentially, like, he was being told by his lawyer to like get his affairs squared up so that he could do jail time. And he was just sitting there. He's just a guy who's working in his garage.
Working. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you said something a few minutes ago that rang completely true with me. First of all, the judicial process, particularly in Canada, where it can be so prolonged, is itself a form of punishment. And there's a fundamental injustice here when a person who's minding their own business on their own property, enjoying peaceful use of their own possessions, wakes up in the middle of the night, and for no wrongdoing on their part, they're going to spend the next 3 years of their life fighting for their freedom in court. It's absurd. It's an outrage. I understand why the law is written the way it is. I do understand the scenarios we're trying to avoid. I understand how a bunch of guys in a boardroom are like, how do we craft the legislation to protect the legitimate rights of self-defense of law-abiding citizens, but also to avoid weird scenarios. We'll leave it at that. I get how they come up with this, but it's not good enough.
You can call it the Pulp Fiction scenario, is sort of the way I've been seeing it described, right?
Yeah, and that's a good way of putting it. About 15 years ago, I don't remember the exact timeline. You might. But I've been writing about this issue and monitoring this issue in my media career for a long, long time. I remember, I'm blanking on the guy's name. There was the guy in Ontario who fired warning shots when his house was being firebombed.
Ian Thompson.
Ian Thompson. There you go. I must have written half a dozen articles about him. Out east, there was Lawrence Manzer, who faced off intruders with an unloaded shotgun and then had to spend years fighting that off. So I've been writing about this issue for a long, long time. The Harper government correctly said that they had to do better. They identified this as an issue. They tried to fix it. What did they actually end up changing? Because that's something I've had lawyers tell me about in the last week, because I've been talking about this. Like, hey, we did change the laws. We have updated the regime. What actually changed?
So there's two things. One thing that they got rid of that I thought was a mistake at the time, and it has kind of proven to be a mistake, is that there used to be a provision saying that you could use any force necessary, not reasonable, necessary to prevent a break in of your home. That provision was eliminated in favor of a provision that just talked about reasonableness generally, and it provided for a much broader context. Now, this was intended to very much provide for expanded self-defense options. That was the intent of it. The problem is that when you hand reasonableness to the courts, the courts are going to interpret them. And I don't think that the Cahill situation was one that was contemplated by the Harper government when they changed the law. Because what happened in Cahill, previously the law had been essentially that Cahill would have been okay to go out and confront this person because he's entitled to do so because that person is stealing his property. And then if that situation turns into a defensive person situation, like you go out to say, stop stealing my truck, and a person tries to attack you, then then you're sort of squared away in the sense that they wouldn't consider your lawful act of interfering with the theft. But the court in Cahill essentially upended that and said that part of the things that a jury has to consider, because they made it very broad, were, was it reasonable for you to go out there? I don't think that was what was Harper's intention, but laws are always written by the government and then interpreted by the courts. One of the problems we have is that there is no off-ramp, is the other issue. There's no way for, in some US states, and we don't necessarily want to model everything off the US, but in some US states, you can bring a pretrial application to have the charges thrown out on the basis of a showing of self-defense.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a much better scenario to say, listen, we have this ability to throw it out, because we see plenty of these cases where people are charged and ultimately acquitted. And the line we always hear is, well, we have to lay charges and let the courts sort it out. That's not actually true. They do have discretion. They can make a decision as to whether or not they want to lay charges. And the other thing is that for most offenses in Canada, there is no statute of limitation. It's not like they're running out of time. So if they decide 6 months from now that, that they want to lay charges, they can do that. But instead, we get this sort of charge first and massive expense imposed on, on the person, and they don't have that sort of off ramp to say, wait, this is self-defense. And so it ends up having to go to a full trial, and the great expense of that. It feels wrong in a lot of these circumstances, and certainly if you explain it to even the people who are like, oh, just let them take your stuff, it's pretty easy to put them into a scenario where they go, well, that's not fair, right? Yeah. I was talking to somebody online who was saying, well, let them take your stuff. And I said, well, okay, what if they were, sexually aggressive towards you? Would you still be like, okay, just let them? And they're like, no, I'd fight back. Okay. So you fight back, you punch them, you knock some teeth out. And so at that point, you're facing charges. Does that feel fair? Does it feel fair that victims of an attempted sexual assault might have to, be going through the courts and paying huge money? Certainly doesn't to me. Does it feel fair that that a homeowner might be bankrupted or have to sell their home, to fund their defense? And one question I get asked by clients is, they've just won, like we come out of a trial and they've just won on a self-defense issue or whatever issue. And they go, okay, how do I get made whole after this? Like, are they going to cover my legal bills?
No, your freedom is how you're made whole.
Yeah. And it's just, and Marie Heinen at one point was giving a talk and she was noting to clients, she's like, I cannot put you back to where you were before the charges were laid. All I can do is try to get you to the best of the bad outcomes that lie at the other end of this. there's nothing that feels like a win at the end of a criminal trial other than just you didn't go to jail. And sure, we might be fine with that in some cases, but it really does not feel fine in others. And I feel like this is a fundamental problem that we've got, and it's a real disjunct between our expectations for how society works and how the law works. Certainly, I don't think anybody would suggest that we should just, have open season on somebody who comes into your house. I say not anybody. There are people who do say
There's
like
some
the
weirdos,
Pulp
yeah.
Fiction, there are people who are like the Pulp Fiction scenario is just fine, but I don't think we're ever going to have that. There's going to be some ability for the courts to review things, but we do need some sort of filter. I think we need an off ramp for those cases where the self-defense is more like self-evident.
Yeah.
In order to avoid that, in some cases, it's a real re-victimization of people.
I think, Ian, I'm glad you said that. I was just like, I know we're getting a bit tight on time here. I got one more question I'll sneak in with you, but I'm really glad you said that because I understand the argument, and I think you've made this point, that there are cases in society where you do need the police to come in and establish the facts. And then there are other cases where you do need a jury or a judge to weigh the law and the facts and make a decision. I get it. Sometimes you really do need the courts to settle it here. But I'm trying to think of any other scenario in your life where, having been the victim of a crime, you were then arrested. And if this was happening routinely in almost any other context, I know it's not a massively common event, but it ain't rare. And if this was happening in any other context, we would stop it. We would shut it down. And we haven't been able to do that here. So here is my question for you. You've touched on this already. And actually, just on the weekend, I was writing something that came very close to what you're proposing here. The idea of an off-ramp. How can we design a system that avoids weird Pulp Fiction revenge scenarios, but also provides low cost, rapid relief for people who did the right thing and really committed no wrong?
I have a sort of proposal and I'm still working on it. Like, I don't think it's something that's ready to like be introduced as a bill or something like that, but I'm still kind of feeling it out. But my sort of proposal was something along the
we'll talk it
lines.
through. Let's noodle it out here.
So, in a situation where it's alleged or established that an intruder forcibly gained entry or gained entry through deception or fraud, and the scenario I'm thinking about here for like deception or fraud is like, "Hi, I'm here from the power company," and then once they're in your door, they're like, "And I've got a gun, and I'm here to like do a home invasion."
Yeah, or knock on the door with a fake package. When someone opens it, they kick the door open. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, so where that's established, the Crown must make an applicate, must have a hearing within 3 months, and I'd put it like on a tight timeline, where they must establish on a balance of probabilities, so more likely than not. It's a gentler test than the beyond a reasonable doubt. But I'd set the criteria high. The sort of proposed criteria I had was something along the lines of grossly excessive to a degree that shocks the conscience of the public. Just to like, that way you rule out situations where the homeowner like tortures somebody or sexually assaults them or in some other way goes into egregious behavior. But you do still protect for things like, well, after the guy went down, you gave him an extra kick. Was that necessary? It's like, well, we're going to forgive the homeowner a little bit of excess because, because they didn't choose this and they're reacting on adrenaline. They might not be a person who's ever prepared for this or even thought about the limits of self-defense because they thought I would never get into a fight. I'm never the sort of person who would ever do that. But if the Crown fails to do so, then the charges would be deemed to be a final acquittal. So, the Crown has this hearing, they bring evidence, they try to show, and if they can't establish on a balance of probabilities that there was something egregious that happened, then the case is dead. They can appeal that decision if there's a legal error or something like that, but ultimately it's an early off ramp, and it basically says you need to have your evidence at the point where you lay your charges because you're going to be on a time limit. And the criteria isn't just reasonable, it goes beyond that, because I think that reasonable is not the appropriate. I don't think reasonable is the appropriate test when we're looking at a home invasion. I think that the home is the most sort of sacred space. It should be the place of safety. It should be the place of, whatever, and when we've got somebody who is intentionally violating that and doing so like in an occupied home, then ultimately I I think that we've got an improper weighing there, and that it should go beyond, simple reasonableness into something, more egregious. Should be our sort of limits there. So I haven't, like, as I said, there's probably problems with it. I haven't fully gamed it out, but it's where I'm thinking.
It makes me feel better because, to be honest, the little idea I was noodling on the weekend when I was writing about this is something not wildly different from that. Like, and the fact that this way better than I do and came up with something. But no, I agree. Some intervening step in cases where violence or force has been used and the police are interested in charges, some intervening step that is fast and low cost, that basically allows the citizen to go, I did what I had to do, wouldn't solve all of our problems, but boy, it would solve most of them. And it would be a relatively easy thing we could do. We could do it relatively quickly. The thing I would mention to you, Ian, before I let you go is, and I've mentioned this already in public, so I'm not revealing anything I haven't mentioned before. A few years ago, there was a man trying to break into my house, and he was being quite persistent about it. And this is in Midtown Toronto, where we would have fairly rapid 911 response times, relatively speaking. My wife and my kids were in the house, and I armed myself, and I made the decision that as long as he was outside, he was no danger to me and my family. He could take my garden gnome. He could get into my garage and walk away with my $200 Canadian Tire snowblower, and I wasn't going to worry about that. But if he came in, he was going to get one verbal warning, and then that was going to be the end. And ultimately, it ended up being, thank God, a completely awful, potentially, case where the man was new to the neighborhood and he'd had a little to drink, and he thought he was going into his house. So perhaps he'd had more than a little to drink. But I didn't know that, right? And I remember just thinking in the moment, I'm not going to let someone get into my house. And again, for all I know, the guy's a kung fu wizard and he drops me with a roundhouse kick, and then my wife and children are at his mercy. I wasn't going to let that happen. But I also wasn't in a hurry to burst out guns blazing and take the guy on in my front lawn. I was safe in my four walls, and I was prepared to stay there.
Yeah, and I very much think there should be different rules for somebody who's come inside your house versus somebody who's outside your house.
Yeah, of course.
I think that's fundamentally, we have an understanding of that's a different sort of scenario. But even, I've had people sort of suggest, like, what about the guy who is drunk and thinks it's his home? I've seen the cases where the guy is drunk, thinks it's his home, breaks in because he thinks it's his home, and engages in violence because now he thinks he's defending his property against a bunch of people
who have moved in.
Why are you in my house?
Yeah.
And at that point, you've got a difficult, scenario there. But, you don't know who this person is. And I can very much envision a case like you and I have both received death threats.
Yep.
And in some cases, credible death threats. Like most of the threats I get, I put into the okay, this is somebody mouthing off.
Yeah.
But there's some of them I'm like, okay, this person is highly concerning. So if somebody breaks into my house, I could see a scenario where I'm going, okay, is this one of the people who wants to kill me? And if, for instance, I was able to get to a firearm and shot at them and, hit somebody, in the leg, and I wouldn't have been intending to shoot the leg because if I'm firing a gun, I'm aiming center mass, but, this person is alive, they escape. And then I call the police and this person gets arrested and they say, I was only there to get his TV. I wasn't going to hurt him. I was just going to grab his, I was just going to grab something valuable and run out. Well, now I'm explaining to a jury that I thought I was under, deadly threat, and the jury might They might understand that, or they might go,
Might not.
were you though? Like somebody sent you in some emails. Okay. They sent a picture of your house. They sent like a picture of your dogs that was taken over the fence. But was that really a deadly threat? And it wasn't this guy. Should I be, potentially going to jail for not knowing that this guy was, how do I ask this guy? Like, are you here to kill me or are you just here for my,
Excuse me, sir. Yeah.
and, if he says, "Oh, I'm not here to hurt you. I just want your valuables."
Oh,
Do
well,
I
I take your
trust the
word for
guy?
that, honorable gentleman, please.
Like you seem really trustworthy, guy with a crowbar in my living room.
Yeah.
Um, and the case that that sort of started all of this, one of the things that just immediately I'm mindful of is it's an apartment. And virtually all apartments are designed with one entrance and one exit, and it's the same place. So anybody breaking into, you're trapped. Or unless you're gonna like go off a balcony on maybe the eighth floor.
Yeah.
And that's a very different scenario. I don't think that we have a good situation where even, we're saying we're not measuring it to a nicety, but we do still, we are still putting people through a very difficult scenario there. And I very much think that, just having somebody going, you know, and the other thing I'm mindful of is New York used to have a serious robbery problem. It was getting to the point where people were like, people in other states were basically saying, don't go to New York because you're going to get mugged. And eventually, what they did is they started having a bunch of police officers pretend to be potential mugging suspects. They would go out and pretend to be tourists, and then when muggers sort of tried to mug them, it went badly for them. And some of the muggers were arrested, and some of the muggers were killed because if you point a gun at a police officer, it doesn't tend to go very well. So mugging in New York went way down as a result. I don't really believe that we can deter a lot of crime generally in the sense of like, I don't generally believe that punishment will prevent people who are otherwise going to commit crimes from committing crimes. But we do know that we can push it around,
Yeah.
that we can have people who go, okay, well, this is too dangerous. Maybe we'll move into this other thing. Like we see catalytic converter theft as a big thing because people have the perception that it's easy and they're unlikely to run into a confrontation.
Because you're not dodging buckshot when you're stealing someone's converter.
I don't have an issue with the notion that breaking into somebody's house while they're there could be viewed as a dangerous activity. And I think properly it should be a dangerous activity.
Yeah.
It should be something that people fear to do, right? That you are just like, I don't want to do this. And that I think that could have social benefit too.
I want to sneak in one clarification question and then I'll let you go. You talked about apartments often being one entrance, one exit. There is no legal obligation to retreat from danger. Like you are allowed, if you're in your home, to stand your ground.
Yes, the courts have said basically, and this is reasonable as well, because you don't know where you're going. If you flee out into the dark, okay, now you've given up all of the advantages that are in your house. You know your house, the other person doesn't. But how do you know you're not fleeing into this guy's getaway driver or, the other two people waiting outside? And for most of us, there isn't really a good place to flee. If you run outside of your house, where are you going? Where, and most like people get targeted in part because they're vulnerable.
Yeah.
At my age and my physical ability, somebody invading my house is likely to be of better physical condition, younger, and
faster,
faster.
Yeah.
Like if I'm running, I'm probably just, having the same fight, tired. That person, if they've engaged in a home invasion, one of their objectives is to control you. It's not to It's not to let you get away because they don't want you to run a block, call the neighbor and get the police on the line. They want, they want you under wraps so that they have as much time as they want to go through and investigate your business. So yes, the law has said there isn't an obligation to flee from your own home, and I think that's a very important principle and one to keep in mind. Except we also don't know how the Cahill decision has affected that. It's so, and the further thing to consider is that in some cases, leaving your house might be, and I don't say, I don't know that it's always, there could be scenarios where it might be the best way to protect your own safety.
Oh, 100%. You got it's all
Yeah.
context specific, right? Like there might be times when it makes perfect sense to run out your back door, hop a fence and yell at your neighbor, call 911. There might also be other scenarios where you're like, no, I'm going to die or survive right where I'm standing.
The other thing is a lot of homeowners are in a position where they can't flee. And I just mean if your kid's asleep in the other room,
I'm not leaving them.
I don't know anybody who'd leave them, right?
Yep.
Your wife is there. She's not, you're staying with her. Wherever she's going, you're going, right? It's so the house is it's a difficult question. And all of these things, I guess the last thing I'd say is I've cautioned people, it's a lot more difficult to live with the consequences of even self-defensive violence than people think it is. If you have to use force in self-defense, PTSD is a common, result of that. And also don't assume you're going to win a confrontation because, there have been people like you go for that kitchen knife, you're going to defend your home, and you walk into a room and there's three guys with shotguns.
Yeah.
That may not be your best day. So how do we, all of these spinning wheels are in the air and we expect people to get it right. And sort of within this realm of reasonableness, it doesn't feel fair.
No. Ian, thanks so much for your time here. Ian Runkle of Bailey on YouTube is where people can find you, and I encourage them to do that. By the way, I do get the reference. It's a little obscure, but I got it. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate this. I wish we weren't still talking about this. I feel like I've been writing about this my entire career, but here we are. So thanks for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, folks, that's another episode of On the Line in the Books. Check us out at readtheline.ca. Share our podcast. Help us grow. We're getting back to work here. By the time we're coming up our next episode, Labor Day will be upon us. Back to reality. Readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe to us there. If you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. Give us a like. If you're listening to us on an audio app, give us a review there. We'll talk to you soon. This is On the Line.